Suspect Love, a Crystal Creek sweet small-town romance short story by Heather Tullis. Vampires were supposed to have cold hands, right? Since it was an industry joke that phlebotomists were vampires, Regan shouldn't be surprised that hers were always freezing in the plasma donation center. Sometimes, as she walked through the steps of preparing a patient, she wished she would be allowed to wear gloves, at least fingerless ones to stay warm. Alas, corporate frowned on anything that might potentially contaminate the plasma donations. Regan finished taping down a young woman's tubing and started the machine. She watched it for a moment to make sure that everything was running properly and pulled a blanket up over the client. The building they were in was mostly one big, open room. So, in an effort to protect the plasma, the company kept the room just a hair colder than was comfortable for all but the most hot-blooded. She tossed her nitrile gloves in a nearby garbage can and rubbed her hands together to warm them for a moment before preparing the tubing for the next donor. The front door opened and Regan looked up, just as she had been doing every few minutes since she arrived 7 hours earlier. Any time now, Brian from corporate was supposed to be there to announce who he had chosen to take over as the lab manager. They were about to close for the night, so it wasn't like he had time to spare. Regan wished he would just arrive already and put her out of her misery. He had to choose her, didn't he? She had been here longer than most, had an associate degree in business management, which was more managerial than anyone else in the office, and she knew this place inside and out. Then there was the fact that she had been running the place competently since Joe, the previous manager, left 6 weeks ago. Seeing that the newcomer was a regular client, however good-looking, she turned back to what she was doing. Regan was just starting to remove the tubing from her current donor when Brian finally walked in. On his heels was the most gorgeous dark-haired hunk to ever cross the threshold of Midwest Blood Services. It was all Regan could do to keep her tongue from lolling. Seriously, how did anyone with hair that dark have eyes that blue? The fact that she could tell the color from across the room only emphasized their color. The hunk looked over and met her gaze, and she could have sworn that a lightning bolt crossed the room. Time stopped, or at least her hands did, because a moment later, she was drawn from his gaze by the young woman's voice. "Hello? Are you okay?" Regan blinked and refocused her attention on the needles she had been about to withdraw. Sorry, got distracted." And boy howdy, did she want to be distracted again. She forced herself to focus on cleaning everything up and giving final instructions to the young woman on the donation bed before letting her go to get paid at the window up front. It took only another minute to finish preparing the bottle of plasma. She then carried it to the payment office to be double-checked and stored. Tim was paying another donor when she entered. He glanced over and grinned. "Did you get a load of the guy Brian brought in a three-piece suit, no less? Brian must be training him or something to bring him around for the announcement." "Yeah, I guess." She hoped he was hanging around for the announcement so she could find out who he was and maybe have a chance to talk to him. Since the waiting area was now empty, Regan returned to her station, wiped everything down for the night, and restocked for the next morning. When word passed her way that there was a quick employee meeting right after work, hallelujah, she detoured into the bathroom to check her hair and makeup first. The last of the donors were standing in line for payment by the time Regan came out of the bathroom, satisfied that at least she didn't look bad, even if it wasn't exactly her best. Brian and his companion were starting to collect a crowd of employees in the back near the main office. Regan joined them, sliding into the closest spot to Brian that she could manage. After a few more minutes of talking to a couple of the guys about the Royals game the previous night, Brian called the meeting to order. "Thanks to everyone who stayed behind. I know you didn't exactly have a lot of notice and are probably anxious to get out the door, so I'll keep this brief. As you all know, we've been looking for a new manager to take over since Joe moved to Colorado. We considered our options very carefully before making a choice. I'd like to introduce your new manager." Regan prepared to step forward. Titus Huber. What the heck? Regan realized he was gesturing to the man he had brought with him, and she felt her face flush. She'd been so sure Brian had been about to say her name. Why did he bring in someone from out of the office anyway? Was she that bad an option? She'd been running all of the reports for the past 6 weeks. It wasn't like she didn't already know the job. I'll walk Titus through the daily reports tonight, and he'll start full-time in the morning. I hope you'll all give him your full cooperation and support. Titus smiled, which made half the women in the crowd look like they were about to swoon. I look forward to getting to know you all better and learning more about what you do here, he said. While Regan normally would have joined the other females in the swoon, his words caught her attention. Learn what they did there? Seriously? He had never worked at a plasma center before. Though she managed to force a smile, she felt like she'd been kicked in the gut. Not only had Brian brought someone from off-site to take over the job she had been doing quite competently for the past 6 weeks, but he didn't even know the business. Brian had to be crazy if he thought she was going to be okay with this. Suddenly, Titus wasn't nearly as handsome as he had seemed at first.
2. Some of the employees wandered off as soon as Brian ended the meeting, including the beautiful brunette Titus had noticed the moment he had walked into MBS. Disappointed, but knowing he would have plenty of other opportunities to talk to her, Titus went through the motions of meeting and greeting those who stuck around. He had already familiarized himself with the employee list and the names of those Brian had told him to watch out for, so it was a good chance to put names to faces. It took about 20 minutes for the rest of the employees to finish cleaning their stations and vacate the building, and for Brian to lock up for the night. Looks like an interesting bunch. Titus followed Brian back to the office. They're a good crew for the most part. There were a few who were off today, and we have some who work only in the mornings, so you'll meet more over the next few days. Did you get a chance to meet all the suspects? Everyone but Regan. I kept listening for her name, but she didn't introduce herself. Yeah, she hurried off as soon as I ended the meeting. I'm afraid she's disappointed not to have been chosen for the job. Brian frowned. I still can't believe she's the one who has been skimming from the register, but I'm sure you'll figure that out soon enough. That's why Titus was here, working in an industry he knew very little about. He was a fixer. He conducted audits, then found out where things were going wrong in a company. His positions were almost always temporary while a company straightened things out, and he had worked management a time or two in the process. But this was the first time he'd worked in the medical field. Brian had spent some time filling him in on the setup and how things worked, and Titus had spent a couple of days looking over the books, tempering. But he knew he would still have a big learning curve as he figured out the flow and feel of the place. In the meantime, he got down to work with Brian, going through the daily reports that needed to be filed and preparing the register drawer for the next morning. He could hardly be faulted for thinking again of the beautiful woman he had locked eyes with when he first came in. After scouting out grocery stores and restaurants in the Kansas City suburb of Crystal Creek, Titus was back at the office bright and early, which meant 9:30 for this particular office. After all, the office didn't open until after 10. That was one thing to be said for Midwest blood services. Sleeping a little later wasn't something Titus could complain about, especially since he'd been working on the West Coast the previous week. 10 minutes before the doors opened, employees started showing up for the morning, clocking in and picking out a workstation. Several of them would rotate through the payment window throughout the day, a practice that would make his job of tracking down the thief more difficult. He had suggested to Brian that they have only one person at the window, but Brian insisted that he didn't want to make too many changes the first couple of days. From Titus's experience with similar jobs in the past, there was little chance that everyone wouldn't be covering their tracks even more carefully just because he was there. The lipstick video camera he had ordered would arrive in a couple of days. Then he would be able to see what was really going on in the payment office. 5 minutes before the doors opened for business, the brunette showed up, moving purposefully to a new station and double-checking everything before she began her work. She brought up more supplies and wiped down her bed, though he was sure that was part of cleanup duty every night. Wanting to meet her, Titus wandered over. I thought the beds were all wiped down at the end of the previous shift. She looked up, her brown eyes meeting his for only a second before she looked away. I was at a different station yesterday, and I find it's best to double-check by doing it again when I get here. That makes sense. We didn't meet yesterday. I'm Titus. She accepted his hand for a shake, her smaller, soft one enveloped in his. He wished he could keep holding it. She didn't actually meet his gaze, so he released her hand as she started speaking. I'm Regan McKinley. I've been doing the office reports for the past while. Let me know if you have any questions. Of course. Of course, the woman he had been determined to woo when he first saw her would be the main suspect of skimming from the company, and he'd taken the job she wanted. That was a perfect way to start any relationship. Sigh. Thanks, I appreciate it. But disappointment filled him. He supposed he would eventually get over the electric pull he had felt toward her from the start, sometime before he turned 80. Putting on a company smile, he continued around the room, meeting a few more people before heading back to the office to review the past week's reports. After about half an hour, there was a knock on his open door. Hey, boss. He looked up and smiled at a cute blonde he'd met the previous evening. Hi, Stephanie. Is everything okay? Of course, you said something yesterday about wanting to learn what we vampires do. Vampires? Where did that come from? It's kind of an industry joke to describe phlebotomists. You know, because we take your blood. He smiled, appreciating what must be an old joke to everyone else who worked here. Gotcha. I need a few more minutes to finish this up, and then I'll come watch you work for a little while. If he remembered correctly, Stephanie was right across from Regan, which would give him a chance to talk to her again and see her work. It was his job, after all. It took longer than the 10 minutes he had suggested to Stephanie, but she was cleaning up to bring out another donor when he stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. He greeted several people along the way, stopped to ask donors how they were doing, and generally just pretended he was a restaurant manager doing the rounds. He came to a stop at the end of Stephanie's station, turning so he could easily glance to the right to also see what Regan was doing. She had a woman on her bed, pumping away on a rubber ball while blood left her vein. The plasma was filtered out before the red blood cells were returned to the donor's veins again. Stephanie left to get a new donor, and Titus's eyes wandered the area. Half the beds went unused. There were clearly not enough donors in Crystal Creek to justify paying more phlebotomists to be there. He would have to ask Brian if they used to be busier, and that's why they had the extra station set up, or if it had just been wishful thinking when they opened the location. Stephanie came back with a 40-something woman and switched the armrest from right to left. She didn't seem nervous to have him there, adding a layer of flirtation to her words as she explained what she was doing to both him and the donor. Are you training someone new? The donor asked. No, she's training me. I'm the new manager and wanted to learn a little more about what the phlebotomists do at this center. How long have you been coming here? Only a few weeks. I used to donate in KC when I lived there, but I moved to Crystal Creek about a month ago. Well, we're glad to have you here. I'm sure it'll all go smoothly. Stephanie seems to have everything well in hand. He patted the donor's foot, thanked Stephanie, and walked over to hear Regan as she set up a new donor on her table. When Regan looked back over her shoulder at him, he smiled. Don't mind me, I'm just observing. This is all new to me, after all. Well, not completely new. He had donated blood to the Red Cross a few times, so a lot of this was familiar, but he was still curious. Regan's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. Of course. She turned back to the donor and pretended Titus wasn't there. He circled around the bed to the other side so he could see better. Her movements were a little jerky, and she tripped over her words a few times. The girl on the bed giggled. Regan, I know he's hot, but seriously, you've done this thousands of times. Sorry. How are things with your classes? Regan continued, a little more polished now, chatting about the weather and weekend plans. She asked about the woman's son, and it was obvious they had talked about him before. Titus wasn't sure if he was glad or sorry that he seemed to make her nervous. It depended on the source of the nerves. Once the woman was set and the donation was underway, he shot Regan a pleased smile and continued around the room. The waiting area out front was getting full, and the people who were processing the donors at the front counter were constantly busy. He stepped into the payment office where the plasma was double-checked. It had a window through which donors were paid before they left. Titus introduced himself to Tim and was walked through the procedures for the plasma and payments, even though Brian had already done all of that the previous day. The refresher and a chance to talk with employees made it time well spent. Normally, the manager also worked with donors, splitting the shift between the payment office and the donors, since there wasn't enough work to stay busy full-time on just the paperwork. But since Titus was still digging through past year's paperwork, there was plenty to keep him busy in the back office. Besides, he had only 2 weeks to figure out who was skimming company money before he had to be at his next position. He liked much about his job: traveling, working with new people all the time, seeing new places. He had worked for companies across the country, including several international offices, which had been a lot of fun. And now he was in Crystal Creek. He glanced out the main office door to see Regan crossing to the payment office with a donor's plasma. He smiled. This place may be small compared to many of the places he had worked, but there were definite perks. Now if he could prove she was innocent and get her to let down her guard a little, hopefully he would be able to quickly tie this all up in a neat bow.
3. The new guy had only been in charge 3 days, and he had already changed the way shifts were organized and the payments and bottles were processed. Regan was annoyed by the changes as she entered information about the donor into the system, while Tim paid the donor at the window a few feet away. "What's the deal, anyway?" Tim asked as he turned back to Regan. "He's never worked in a place like this. He didn't even know what we did when he started, and he's already shaking things up. You'd think he would at least take a few weeks to get a feel for things." Though Regan had said nearly the same thing in a phone call to her sister during her lunch break earlier, she didn't join in the gripe session. Tessa had talked her down and gotten her to admit that the changes weren't all bad. Regan had even considered making a couple of the changes herself. But since she had only been doing the manager's work without the title for the past 6 weeks, she hadn't felt like she could implement any changes. She had been hoping to phase them in over the next few months if she had been appointed manager. That thought brought back her annoyance over Titus being hired instead of her. And annoyance wasn't all she felt. She was a little hurt that Brian hadn't chosen her. Those two emotions seemed to travel together lately. She carefully chose a diplomatic response to Tim. "I'm sure we just need a little while to get used to the changes." Right, but he didn't seem at all convinced. Regan keyed in the rest of the details about the donor and scanned the barcodes on the plasma. She looked up as the door opened and Titus stuck his head in. Yes, he really was as cute as she had thought when she first saw him, even if she didn't want to think so. "Regan, right?" he asked her. Yes. She made 2 last clicks with her mouse and stashed the plasma in the temperature-regulated cooler. "Could you come chat with me in the office before you get your next donor?" "Of course." What did he want? She filed the paperwork, said goodbye to Tim, and followed about 20 steps behind Titus toward his office. When she got to the doorway, Titus ushered her in, then closed the door. He pulled the blinds, opening the window to the main room so others could see in. "I understand you've been doing my job for the past few weeks." 6 weeks, she interrupted. "Right, 6 weeks. I'm having an issue with the weekly report. Could you help me out? I managed the other ones fine, but it's been a while since Brian walked me through it." Annoyance stiffened her shoulders, and her voice followed suit. "Of course. I appreciate it. I know you interviewed for the job, and it's clear that everyone here likes you. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry I have the job, but I'm sorry that things didn't work out for you." His gaze lifted to hers, his dark eyes brimming with sincerity. "Thanks." She couldn't help but respond to his words, even though a little voice inside her was still saying that she shouldn't give in. He gestured to one of the chairs pulled in front of the computer. She sat down. For the next half hour, they huddled over the computer as she walked him through the report, explaining some of the terminology he hadn't yet picked up, and watched him input the data. "Thanks so much," he said when he finished the report. "I appreciate your gracious attitude." "You're welcome." She found it was easy to be gracious around him. He wasn't the least touchy as she corrected him and walked him through everything, though to be fair, it seemed he was finding excuses to drag out their conversation. Not that she minded. "How long have you worked here?" "I took the phlebotomy class at the Tech during my last semester of high school and started here a few weeks later. It's not exactly glamorous, but it's steady work and the pay is decent. Not great, but decent. The manager position came with a nice little raise, which was only one of the reasons she had hoped to get it. She could pay her expenses on what she earned now, but there sure wasn't much left over. Wow, you must really like it here." "I like it well enough. Regular hours, Joe was a good boss, and it's close to home. My other options are to get a job in the hospital lab, which is about the same income, but the hours are more likely to change from day to day. I could get hired by the Red Cross, but then I'd be traveling all over the region, and my schedule would change a lot. So I stay, especially since I thought I might be able to move to manager someday. You never know. That could still happen." Titus closed the software program and turned to her. "I imagine there has been some grumbling about the changes I'm making." She squeezed her lips together for a moment. "Maybe a little, but nothing that won't go away after everyone adjusts. I like the new protocols when we log the donations." "Thanks. I hope you're right." He stood. "I'd better let you get back to work. Thanks again for helping me out." "You're welcome." She stood as well. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I'd really like to thank you, maybe with dinner?" Surprise shot through her. "Is he asking me out? Like a date?" He paused for a moment, as if considering. "Yeah, I think so," Regan considered. He was nice, really nice, and she definitely felt chemistry, more than just that shot of connection she had felt the moment they had seen each other for the first time. Sitting this close to him, talking through the reports, she felt something more. She wanted to find out if she still felt that way after spending some time with him away from work. "Okay, I think I'd like that. What did you have in mind?" "How about brisket and noodles? I've heard good things about that place." "Sounds good." They set a time, and she returned to the floor to her normal work. She caught herself periodically glancing toward the office that afternoon, excited about their date that evening.
For Titus didn't know what had come over him. He'd had no intention of asking Regan for a date. She was a suspect in his investigation, after all. Getting involved with her was a really bad idea. Monumentally bad. He knew better than to go out with a beautiful woman who might end up in jail for stealing from the company. But he hadn't been able to help himself. At first, the invitation had been something that just popped out of his mouth, despite his intention to keep everything strictly business. But after she mentioned the word date, he had decided to go with it. It was what he wanted. Now here he was, watching the clock and wondering if spending time with her would help him figure out if she was responsible for the theft. The more he examined the books, the worse the theft looked. It had started about 5 years earlier. At first, just $10 or $20 per week. Last month, though, it was closer to $100 per day, sometimes more. $3,000 or more per month was no longer pocket change. That brought him back to Regan, beautiful Regan, with the laughing eyes and gentle bedside manner that endeared her to so many of the donors. He had caught her laughing with several of their regulars and offering words of support to at least one of the women who worked there. Most people in her position would have felt justified in finding an excuse not to help him out or to make the experience painful, but she didn't. She had obviously been unhappy about his appointment as manager, but she was showing a lot of grace despite that. No one had intrigued him more, which was why he probably shouldn't be going out with her tonight. He checked his watch one last time. She had opted to meet him at the restaurant, and he would need to leave soon if he wanted to be there on time. He checked his appearance in the budget motel's mirror, then said a little prayer that everything would go well. Brisket and noodles was a local restaurant owned by a former hockey star. Titus arrived 3 minutes before 6 and hurried inside, happy when he found he had arrived before Regan. He hated making other people wait for him. Only a minute later, she walked in wearing a ruffled blue skirt and matching top that made her eyes shine. He'd only ever seen her in her white lab coat at work, so this was a nice change. "I hope you didn't wait long," she said when she saw him. "No, not at all, and you're a minute early, so no worries." "Good, I hate being late. It's so rude." "I totally agree." They followed the hostess to a booth along the back wall and took their seats. "Have you eaten here before?" he asked Regan as they looked over their menus. "Several times. They have a nice selection. The owner's wife owns Sweet Confections. The bakery. Have you tried it yet?" "No. Where is it?" Regan talked about the businesses moving into Indulgence Row on Taylor Avenue and how excited she was about the bookstore that would be opening before too long. They talked books and movies, their mutual love of baseball, and all forms of Mexican food. Regan was surprised that they had so much in common and how easy it was to talk to him. They lingered over dessert for a solid hour before she glanced at her watch and sighed. "Almost 8 already? I've had a lot of fun." "Me too. I was half afraid we would sit down here and have nothing to talk about but work. Thank goodness that didn't happen." She smiled when he stood and held out a hand to help her from her seat. Titus tucked her hand under his arm and grabbed the leftovers they'd had boxed to take home. People would have to be a complete mismatch not to find something to talk about. I guess we're not a complete mismatch then. Not at all, in fact. They had a lot more in common than he'd had with most women he'd dated. T-end. Not that he and Regan were dating exactly. It was only one date, so it wasn't inappropriate. Thank goodness. Titus pushed the front door open, and she preceded him through it. He followed her to her car, wondering if he dared steal a kiss, or if that would be crossing a line considering the complications in their relationship. "Why Crystal Creek?" she asked as they came to a stop in front of her car. "What? What made you come here? I mean, obviously the job, but how did you come to apply for a job like this, in an industry you knew nothing about, in such a small town?" He flashed a grin. If only she knew. "I finished up my previous job early, and Brian heard about me from one of his friends. The timing was just right." "Isn't it odd how things happen sometimes?" She leaned back against her car. He passed her the carton with her leftovers. Somehow Titus thought she was even more beautiful now, after spending time with her, than she had been before, and he hadn't thought that was possible. He hated that she was a suspect in the theft, and wished so much that he could just tell her what was going on, but that was definitely out of the question. His gaze dipped toward her lips, then pulled up again to her eyes. No way was he kissing her before he could clear her name. "I probably ought to let you go. Next time I'll let you pick me up," she said. He smiled, happy that she wanted there to be a next time. "I'd like that." He needed to see where and how she lived, after all. If she was bringing in an extra 30 grand a year, her lifestyle would show it. Her car definitely didn't. It was old, and the paint was no longer shiny, even though it was obvious she had washed it recently. What he could see through the window indicated that she took good care of it. Stepping back, he let her get into her car, though she looked as disappointed at the lack of kiss as he was. "See you tomorrow." "See you then." He waved and headed back across the parking lot to his own car, though he turned and watched her pull out onto the street. He should have gone for the kiss. He was already in way too deep when it came to Regan.
5. Though she had never before been especially concerned about what she wore to work, Regan found herself standing in front of her closet in the morning, debating over outfits, just as she had done the previous evening. Annoyed with herself, she shook her head and grabbed a favorite tee and jeans. Titus had seen her in similar clothes every day and hadn't seemed to care. Besides, it just didn't make sense to wear really nice clothes to work when there was a chance of blood getting onto them. Not that she had that problem often, but at least once per month someone managed to get blood on the clothes she wore under the lab coat. She arrived at work 10 minutes early, so she would have time to say hi to Titus before double-checking her station for the day. Unfortunately, he had been trapped in the office talking to Stephanie when she arrived, and he wasn't alone until Regan already had a donor on her bed. Oh well, there would be time later. Though she had thought that she noticed Titus before, she found herself noticing the way he worked his way around the room, greeting people, and stepping into the payment office 7 or 8 times that day. What was going on? Was he bored of the job already? And did he actually like the way Stephanie hung all over him whenever he walked past? Trying desperately not to be jealous, Regan focused on her work again. Titus liked her. He had talked about their next date. Wait, she had brought up the next date, not him. And who was to say that he wasn't going out with Stephanie as well? Well, it wasn't like they were exclusive or anything. It had been only one date, but it felt like a bigger deal than that. Annoyed with herself, Regan huffed and put it out of her mind. She needed to get this donor off the table and out the door. There would be time to obsess about her boss later. And obsess she did. But she managed to save most of her obsession until after she went home that night, without a date set up with Titus.
Titus had wanted to ask Regan out again. It had been on the tip of his tongue at least a dozen times, but they had never been alone, and he knew he needed to keep his distance until he could be sure about her. He checked out her address in the employee files and drove past her apartment that night, noticing that it was far from fancy. He walked inside her apartment building and asked to see an apartment. The rates were definitely reasonable, and the apartments were fairly nice for the price. Her car was parked in a stall in front of the building. She said she had a roommate who was none too tidy. If she had been the one skimming at work, he was sure she would have gotten an apartment on her own. That reassured him as he returned to his extended stay hotel and started watching the videos from work. He would need to watch until his eyes started to bleed, but maybe he could put this all behind him by the end of the week. There was nothing he wanted more than to settle everything, turn in the final reports to Brian, and hand the management reins to Regan. But before he got to the hotel, he made a stop at D. Kwan's for Chinese takeout. Back at his temporary home, Titus used chopsticks to pick out bits of orange chicken while he set up his laptop to play the day's video. When his phone beeped, he paused the video and glanced down. The text was from Regan. Indian Jones and the Last Crusade and peanut butter sandwiches. How I spend my nights. How about you? He smiled. Wish I were there. DeQuan's takeout and several hours of work ahead. Indian Jones is the best. Seriously, why do you have so much office work? An extra project Brian asked me to handle, just going over old reports and analyzing things. The joys of an accounting background. Ah, no wonder he decided to hire you. Accounting and I are not great friends. I can manage, but it's not my first love. Oh, good. I was hoping that would be me. He waited for her response, worried about how she would respond. It seemed to take forever. Sorry, too late. That was Jason McCormick when I was still in 3rd grade and he was in 8th. He saved me from a bully. He was flooded with relief when she seemed to brush off his comment. How could I ever hope to compete? Who is this Jason? Did you ever date? No, not at all. I got over him a few months later. He just got engaged to someone else, actually. Oh, good. Glad not to have that competition anyway. He was 95% sure that she was innocent, but she was far too enticing for him to be impartial. It was a good thing the mounting evidence had been ruling her out. Don't worry, there's no comparison. And even without Adeline, you would totally beat him hands down. He doesn't know what he's missing. When there wasn't an immediate response, Titus turned the video back on. He needed to tie this all up ASAP, and not just because of how things were developing with Regan. He would be starting his new job in a little more than a week, and he needed to be done at the plasma center before then. Part of the reason he had changed up the work assignments in the payment office a few days earlier had been to get Regan out of there, at least for a couple of days. That would make it easier to eliminate her as the one responsible for the skimming. Also, longer shifts allowed him to focus on one person at a time and minimize the number of people who could get into the cash drawer. The video only recorded when there was movement on the screen, thank goodness, so the 8 hours of time that the business was open resulted in only 4 hours of video. He sped that up to time and a half, fast enough that he wasn't spending all evening every night checking out the video, but not so fast that he would miss something hinky going on at the counter. After 4 days, he was just starting to see the pattern. 2.5 hours of mind-numbing video later, he was debating whether to turn it off and go for a walk before his eyes fell out, or to finish it to get it over with. Just then, he received another text from Regan. "You about ready to take a break?" You read my mind. Immediately, there was a knock at his door. He paused the video and answered the door, surprised to find Regan standing outside. "Hey, that was really fast. I hoped you could use a break from crunching numbers. I brought ice cream." She lifted the plastic bag with a carton inside. "How did you know which unit I'm in?" He'd mentioned to her that he was staying at the extended stay motel, but he was pretty sure he hadn't mentioned his room number. "Your car is parked right outside, and I could see you through the window." She pointed to the curtains, which were open about 6 inches. "What were you watching?" He considered for a moment before ushering her inside. She hadn't worked in the payment office or touched the payment drawer for the past 2 days, but the thefts hadn't changed. That wasn't all. He had definitely seen some action going on today, so he was going to risk telling her the truth, or at least part of it. "Brian wanted me to keep it hush-hush, but I think we've gotten to the point that I can tell you." He went into the kitchenette and found a couple of spoons in the drawer. "I don't have any bowls." "No problem. We can dig right into the carton if you're not squeamish about germs." He liked the way she thought, and when she unearthed the Goo Goo Cluster ice cream from the sack, he grinned. It had always been one of his favorite. "Sounds perfect." He pulled out a chair for her at the small table and sat around the corner from her so they could both easily reach the carton. "So, what's the deal?" Regan took the spoon he handed her and dug into the opened carton. "The company recently had someone audit all of the plasma centers it owns. At first, they were excited that this center had a much higher rate of donors returning for all 4 times in a 2-week period than any of the other centers. Then they realized that things actually looked a little off." "What do you mean?" "This location shows that an average of more than 90% of donors come twice a week, every single week. That's much higher than the average. High enough to actually be suspicious, because when we looked at individual donor records, that was not the case." The taste of chocolate sauce, vanilla ice cream, and caramel burst in his mouth with the next bite, and he stopped talking so he could take a moment to savor it. He let her think about what he had said for a long moment as he enjoyed the ice cream and wondered if she was putting it together. "Okay, I agree. After working with the donors for so long, I know we don't have that higher return rate. So what's the deal?" "The deal is that they get paid more if they're coming back consistently." She stopped with the spoonful of ice cream, poised halfway to her mouth. "Whoa, are you saying that someone's stealing from the company?" "That's right. I spent several days before I came here reviewing records and verifying that someone is processing payments to show that the person is returning for their 3rd or 4th visit when it's really their 1st or 2nd. Whoever is responsible must be pocketing the money. The amount that seems to be going into someone's pocket has been growing for the past several years." "How far back does it go?" Regan asked. "At least 5 years. Before that, the numbers looked a little high, but not so much that I could easily prove things were out of whack, prove that the payments were higher than they should have been. That's part of what I've been doing in the office so much." Regan glanced toward his computer and frowned. "Is that video from the payment office?" Whoops, he hadn't meant for her to see that, even though he was certain she wasn't involved. "Yeah, we installed a tiny camera to see if we could catch someone skimming. The person is being very subtle about it, but I think I've caught a pattern. I want 1 more day of video to be sure." She paid particular attention to her spoon for the next several seconds, then said, "Brian thought I was responsible. You thought I was responsible. And that's why he made you the manager, because you thought I was a thief." Titus chose his words carefully. "You've been doing the paperwork for the past several months. Brian didn't believe it was you, but he didn't want to tell you about the search until I was absolutely certain that you weren't involved somehow. Granted, Joe didn't figure it out either, but since it continued after he left, we figured it had to be someone else. So, do I assume from the fact that you're telling me now that I'm no longer a suspect? You're definitely not a suspect anymore. Though honestly, you were only on the list in the first place because it would have been irresponsible not to put you there. You've not been within 5 feet of the cash drawer in the past few days, but the pattern has continued. Plus, the camera doesn't lie. I'll be forwarding some clips to Brian tonight. Do you have irrefutable proof? No, but close enough to justify more research. Tell me, he said as he dug his spoon back into the carton of ice cream. Have you heard any rumors about the camera? Nope, not a hint. When was it installed? A few days ago. It's just a basic setup with a single lipstick cam. Good that no one has mentioned it. I was worried the person responsible might have been blocking what they were doing. So, is this your first sting? She asked. Titus laughed. Sting might be a bit strong of a description, but no, this isn't the first time I've helped track down the source of a bookkeeping issue. It's kind of what I do. She took a moment to savor the ice cream she had just put in her mouth. It's what you do. So how many companies have you worked for? Quite a few. It would take more math than I have brains to produce at the moment. I've moved around a lot to different cities, both in the US and abroad. Oh, that sounds like fun, seeing different places. I've never traveled more than 4 or 5 hours away. She paused again to swallow, though her mouth had been empty. Where was the coolest place you've lived? Geneva, Switzerland. He enjoyed it when her eyes popped. Then he settled in to tell her all about it.
7. Though Regan enjoyed spending time with Titus, she liked him more every time they spoke. Her big fear was that he would finish the job at the plasma center and head off to some other part of the country. Not that they had any kind of understanding or that he owed her anything. They had shared dinner twice, shared the carton of ice cream, and sent a flurry of text messages on the evenings when they weren't together. That wasn't exactly a commitment. Still, there was a gnawing pang in her chest when she thought of him moving on and forgetting her. She supposed she would have to just take what she could get for as long as this lasted. Titus pulled her aside when she returned from her lunch break a few days later. Change of plans. Can you cover the payment office and process donations this afternoon? Sure. Wasn't Tim supposed to handle that? Yes, but, well, he won't be coming back in this afternoon. Why not? Did he get sick? Was he in an accident? No, Titus looked around them as if checking to make sure that no one would overhear them. That issue that we discussed the other night. It only took Regan a second or two to register what he was saying and realize he was talking about the skimming. Really? Stupid idiot. What was he thinking? I mean, obviously I can guess, but really, I just don't get people. So, if you'd fill in for him. Right, the reason they were discussing this to begin with. Oh, of course. Being short-handed one station shouldn't be a big deal. I'll cover the payments. 2? 2 stations? Titus's voice dropped to just above a whisper. Tim wasn't acting alone. One of the guys led a donor back to his station, and she glanced around the room, trying to figure out who else could have been involved. It took only a few seconds for her to spot the empty station where Stephanie had been working that morning. Really? She didn't particularly like Stephanie, but she hadn't pegged Stephanie as the thief. She couldn't believe the two of them had been stealing for so long. They hardly even seemed to be friends. Had she missed their relationship? Had they been working together? Or had they been skimming separately? Just, wow. And of course, I'm happy to do whatever you need. I have questions for you, but they'll wait. Thanks. Regan headed for the payment office to take over. She couldn't help but look back over her shoulder. She was pleased to find Titus was still watching her. It was nearly the end of day when Brian walked in. He looked more than a little tired. He greeted several of the employees, mouthed to Regan that they needed to talk, then headed for the main office where Titus was bent over a keyboard. Curious about what had happened that afternoon, Regan watched the clock and counted how many beds still held donors. The waiting area was empty, so when these donors left, that was it for the day. Regan drummed her fingertips on the counter as she waited for the next person to walk over. Everyone seemed to be moving in slow motion. She had cleaned up her station for the day during a previous lull, so she had nothing to distract her while she waited for the end of the day. Would Brian mention anything about Tim and Stephanie? And how long would Titus be sticking around now that his primary responsibility was over? Maybe he would stay on. Shauna stopped at the payment window and asked, "Do you know what's going on?" Brian asked everyone to wait around for a moment. And what happened to Tim and Stephanie after lunch? Did they get in an accident or something? I don't know what happened. Not exactly, anyway. She was as curious as anyone. Only two more people to finish up, and we can find out, I guess. Maybe they ran off together to get married. They've been getting pretty hot and heavy lately. Wow. Regan really had missed the clues, apparently. I had no idea. Oh, yeah. I've seen them talking in the parking lot and out around town several times. They're pretty hands-off in here, though. Regan really had nothing more to say about that. Thankfully, one of the two remaining donors approached the window, giving her a reason not to continue the conversation. Finally, Regan locked up the payment office and joined everyone else in the crowd around the main office. Now that everyone is here, Brian opened, I want to thank you all for your patience through the transition the past couple of weeks. Titus has done a great job at troubleshooting, spotting inefficiencies, and solving some problems we were having. I want to thank him for stepping in as manager for a couple of weeks while we straightened things out. He has another job waiting for him on Monday, so tomorrow will be his last day here. Monday morning when you arrive, you'll be under new/old management. Regan will be officially taking over. There will be a few more adjustments to make, specifically in the payment office, but you'll all get to see what that looks like once the software is operational. What's wrong with the software we have now? Shauna asked. The new software will directly connect payments with the individual and his or her donations. It's something we've been implementing in all of our plasma centers over the past few weeks. It won't affect most of your day-to-day work at all, just the payment and processing department. Thanks, everyone. You can clock out and go home now. Congratulations, Regan. Regan stood, stunned. She knew that Titus often worked for only a short time at each job, but it had been only 2 weeks since he came to the plasma center, and things were just starting to get interesting between them. How could they determine if their relationship was going to lead anywhere if he was in New York City or Guadalajara next week? She accepted the congratulations a bit woodenly, torn between excitement at the job and despair at losing Titus. She forced a smile as she spoke to all her coworkers. This is what she had wanted from the beginning, only it wasn't the same now. As the other employees melted away, Brian approached her. Congratulations, Miss Manager. Are you ready to dig back in? Or did you decide that you liked the lack of responsibility since Titus got here? Forcing herself to focus on the conversation and put aside the things that had been racing through her mind, she said, I actually missed it. It'll be nice to get that raise too. She would not be making enough to kick out her roommate and have a place of her own, but now she could start saving for a new car. Speaking of, I've approved a bonus that should make up the difference in your paycheck that you would have gotten if you have been the manager since Joe left. Nice, thanks. No problem. The IT guys will be here to install the new software next week, and we'll do a little training before changing over to it full time. It'll solve that payment issue we've been dealing with. Titus mentioned that he filled you in. Yeah, after he ruled me out. Regan looked around to make sure that she, Brian, and Titus were the only ones within hearing distance. So what exactly happened today? I took the paperwork to the police department this morning, and they picked up Tim and Stephanie on their way to lunch. I wanted to keep it away from here. No need to distract everyone and cause a scene here. I agree. So what do I say when people ask about them? As little as possible, Brian said. Anywhere from they no longer work here to they were let go, but don't comment about the skimming. I'm sure everyone will get an earful from the two of them soon enough. They're both expected to get out on bail after their hearings next week. That could be fun. She really hoped they didn't show up angry. The joys of being the boss. He patted her on the shoulder as if he knew what was going through her head. But you'll do fine. You still have the key? Of course. Great. I'll let you lock up then. See you next week. He turned and headed for the back door. Regan looked at Titus, and he looked back. Not sure how to ask him about what would happen next between them, she suggested. We should double-check to make sure everything is settled for the night. Yeah, I'll check the door and waiting area. She nodded and headed back to the donation area, stopping to glance at the supplies in the back room. They would need to place an order tomorrow. Everything else looked fine. You want to grab some dinner? Titus asked. Yeah. Chipotle? It's just around the corner from my place. Sure, we can park there and walk over. She parked in the lot across from him, and they went to his room so he could lock up his laptop. When he opened the door to his room, she was stunned. He had already packed. Only a couple of things still sat out, but one suitcase lay open on his bed, full of clothes, and the other lay next to it, more than half full. Wow, you don't waste any time, do you? Are you flying out tomorrow afternoon or something? Why should it hurt so much that he hadn't even mentioned leaving to her? It wasn't like he owed her anything. His brow furrowed. No, I'm not flying anywhere. I'm just going to drive to my new apartment. I can move in tonight. So his new job was within driving distance. Good for him. Unless he would still be in the greater Kansas City area, though, it wouldn't be much use. And how far is the drive? You know Crystal Creek Apartments over on Walnut? She narrowed her eyes at him. That's where she lived. Yes, I'm in A327, Titus grinned. I know, I'm the new tenant of A343. Nice to meet you, neighbor. He put out his hand for a shake, but when she stood there, dumbfounded, he took her hand in his. Aren't you happy? Of course, I'm just confused. I thought your new job starts on Monday. Yes, at Stone Enterprises. She felt her head tip even more to the right as she tried to understand. But how did you manage to get something there so fast? You've only been here 2 weeks. Laughing, Titus pulled her into a hug. Oh, Regan, I was hired there first. When Brian mentioned to Reese Stone that he needed a good CPA to figure out what was going on here, Reese said I would be free for a few weeks before starting work for him. Reese is the one who gave Brian my contact info. Regan pulled back so she could see him clearly. So you were always going to stay in town? Yes. And you let me think that you were going to take off and move to Mexico or something after this? Now he was the one to look confused. You're not happy? Because I have to tell you that I was very happy to realize that the first time I get a permanent position, I actually have someone here that I want to stick around for. Her annoyance melted away. You do? He stepped closer and cupped her elbows. Yeah, I'm crazy about you, Regan. The first time I saw you across the room was like a punch to the throat. I couldn't have talked right then if I'd tried. Really? Really. I've been wanting to tell you that ever since. And now that I'm technically not your boss anymore, there's something else that's been on my mind. He tugged her in, sliding his hands around her back. Am I going to like it? She asked, all her previous pique disappearing at his proximity and the look in his eyes. I sure hope so, and I hope you'll be happy to have me as a neighbor. She slid her hands up his arms, along his shoulders, and around his neck. I'll try not to hate it too much. You'll have to come over for dinner some night. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapped around her waist. Or every night. His lips brushed her cheek along her jaw to her chin, causing chills to run down her neck and shoulder before they landed on her own. The kiss was soft and sweet, testing, seeking, and she reciprocated. She had daydreamed about this moment more than a few times since he had appeared in her life. But this was better than she had ever expected. Everything about him seemed better than she had expected. That sounds perfect, she whispered in muffled sounds against his lips. They separated a long moment later, slightly out of breath. I'm really glad I'm staying. You're the one woman I don't think I could ever leave behind. She showed her agreement on that point with another kiss. Thanks for listening to Suspect Love, a Crystal Creek sweet romance short story. Please like this story to help others find it and subscribe to be notified when I post other sweet romance or romantic suspense stories. Hope to see you soon.